Right, a privilege to be here. Good to see everyone. Good morning, brethren and friends. Good morning to you. Pleasure to see each and every one out this morning to worship. It's a beautiful day this morning. Fall has arrived. The colors are great. God's hand is in all of it. I do want to remind what has been said, Denny, in the announcements. The round robin, I know that we have never participated in one, I don't think, but it's been good. Steve Fox had a great lesson at sunrise the first Monday in October. Loving God, and then Elvis Galbraith, I think is his name, was at Mineral Wells last Monday and presented a lesson on loving your neighbor. Next Monday is our Monday to host the round robin, and as Danny pointed out, there will be refreshments afterwards. That's how it's been going this week or this month, and Larry will be speaking on testing your love. Tomorrow, be at Lubeck, yours truly will be speaking. And I don't remember how I was at the first meeting. There were 2 or 3 meetings, and we picked out a theme. I really can't remember, and it is on the greatest commands. And I just remember Jeannie asked me what mine was, and I said loving yourself, and she said, "Of course it is." So, I don't know how that went over. I've seen the message outside a lot of churches, and I'm sure, and I don't think I've seen any in Jackson County yet. Maybe I have 1 or 2, but there's always these marquees and these signs outside of church buildings, and I've noticed a few that says Spirit-filled worship, and just a passionate Spirit-filled worship. And the idea when a church puts out signs like that is the passerby sees that. He's saying, you know what, I want to go there. That's what I want to be involved in, a passionate, Spirit-filled worship service. And it sounds exciting. And who wouldn't want a passionate, Spirit-filled worship instead of this just ho-ho, so-so worship service that a lot of churches have these days? And you think about that, passionate-filled service, Spirit-filled service. What image does that bring in mind? I'm reminded of an email that a friend of mine got. This is what kind of turned this lesson around. But listen, I want to read it to you. For the past several weeks, Mary Jo has been noticing one of those message billboards that many churches use. This one advertises passionate, Spirit-filled worship. Mary Jo is intrigued by the thought that worship could be passionate and filled with the Spirit. After all, her worship experience usually goes something like this. My skirt is so tight I can barely breathe. I can't wait to get home and change. I sure hope we finish on time today. I've got a casserole in the oven that's going to burn if we go into overtime. Oh no, Brother Carey is making the announcements. He always mutilates the names on the sick list. Well, at least we got one of the good song leaders today, number 245. I really don't like that song, and we sing it every Sunday. No tear-dimmed eyes. That was really a sad movie we watched last night. I just cried and cried. Brother Edwards, he preaches when he prays. It's our bonus sermon. I wish he'd get on with it. That screaming kid is driving me nuts. Oh, man. All the guys at the Lord's table, look how nice they look, except Morris. He always looks like he just got out of bed. Now, why do they pass the tray that way? You know what? It'd been a lot easier if they'd have passed it the other way. Hey, isn't that little girl cute? She's got such pretty curls. Wait, that's a boy. Why do we stand up when we sing? Why do we have to stand up when we sing? It's always too cold in here. That's the same sermon we heard last month. You know what? If you two don't sit still and be quiet, I'm going to take you out. What? Not now. That's really a neat graphic-looking slide he's got there on the PowerPoint. I wonder where he got that. I need to get on that computer today and make some birthday invitations. And I've got to order a cake. I guess I'll be going to the store today. Sit still. That boy's going to need some new shoes soon. Now, that was a good closing prayer. Sounded just like the opening. You know what? No doubt. Some of us could use a good dose, just like Mary Jo, of good, Spirit, passionate-filled worship service. And you know what? A lot of modern churches and a lot of modern people expect that when they come to a worship service. And now I want to look at what some people expect, and then I want to explain what God expects in our worship and what God might define as spirit, passionate-filled worship. What people expect and want from a passionate-filled worship service. You know, let's face it. Mary Jo, there's a lot of distractions. There's a lot of people like Mary Jo that sit in a worship assembly like this, and they're just distracted about everything. A lot of the distractions they are external distractions. You got babies crying, you got phones ringing, you got children misbehaving, you got somebody clipping their nails, you might have a goofy preacher that has a nervous twitch that you just cannot get off of, and you just watch for that, and stuff like that bugs you. And some of the distractions are not always external in our worship service. Some of them are internal. You might not got a lot of sleep last night. You might just be dozing off. You're tired. You might not eat breakfast this morning. You just, your belly's growling. You might be have the football fever, those games. You might be worried about your team. Gene's not worried about Pittsburgh anymore. But you might have that. You might be thinking about the bills you got to pay and all those things that you've been worried about all week. Some distractions in your worship service, they might be internal. And because of these distractions, when we come to worship service, I tell you what, we want something in our worship service that just grabs our attention, that is attention arresting. We want to be caught up in our worship service. We don't want to be distracted about anything. And we're just certain that if the Spirit was filling us up, and if it was a Spirit-filled worship, that He would just grab us and He wouldn't let us go. We're just sure of that. We'd zone out in worship service, and nothing could possibly distract us from our worship service. We would listen to the singing. We would listen to the songs, and they would be so intense and so well led and so well sung that we would be hanging on every word. And the prayers, they would be so moving that we would listen to them intently, and we would enjoy those prayers. And whoever spoke at the Lord's table did such a good job that we could just literally see Jesus hanging on the cross. And the sermon that we would hear, so powerful that we just sit at the edge of our seats. Oh, we want that kind of worship. And there are a lot of churches out there saying, that's what we're going to do. But a lot of churches that are trying to offer that, they've moved away from the reverence of the assembly. And they've moved away from the study of the assembly to the glitz and to the glamour and the entertainment of those assemblies, and thus they advertise them out. That's why you're going to have a passionate, Spirit-filled worship here. It's not going to be like that other stuff that you've been used to. Very few people, secondly, like the same old, do we? We just get tired, we're bored easy, we just get bored fast. We've been doing this for 2,000 years. And people just don't like the same old, and certainly worshiping God should never ever be boring, should it? And falling into the rut of worshiping God, after all, we've been tuned in to the media, and they think that every 10 seconds that comes on that screen, every 10 to 15 seconds, there's got to be something new in order to hold your attention. Because of boredom, and we want different kinds of worship experience, we're wanting something that is spiritually spontaneous. That's right. The Spirit's just going to grab us. He's going to take a hold of us in a spontaneous manner. And we're just going to let Him have control. And whatever He comes up with when we're here during that worship assembly, it's just going to be led by Him. Wouldn't that be awesome? That we just count on Him to do that? That's the way it ought to be in worship service. Surely we shouldn't have to think about our worship service, should we? Much less plan our worship service. We're going to leave it up to the Spirit. We're just going to let Him fill us up with Himself, and therefore our worship service, it's going to be just we're going to fly by the seat of our pants, and all the while we're going to be claiming that the Spirit is piloting us all through the worship service, because He's here, and this worship assembly is Spirit-filled. Well, that's what a lot of churches offer. When they move away from the worship assemblies, away from decency and order, they have spontaneous worship. They have spur-of-the-moment preaching. And really, a lot of churches are just having basic get-togethers, and when folks feel like standing up and saying something, they do. Because that's spirit-filled, passionately spirit-filled. Finally, I think what we're looking for out there when we see those kind of signs, what drives this society? What drives the American society? Emotion. Feel emotion, big time. What's the saying? If it feels good, do it. That's our motto. That's what we go by. And because of our feelings, we want a different kind of worship experience. Emotionally electrifying. We're certain if the Spirit was here, that our worship service would be passionate and spirit-filled, and there would be chills that run up and down our spine the whole time that we're here. No doubt about it. We want something that just grabs a hold of our heart and just shakes it, electrifies us emotionally. Yes, sir, we're sure to know when we leave here, this is how you do church. This is what it means to feel church in an emotional way. We know that. Well, that spine-tingling, gut-wrenching, heart-rending, earth-shattering emotion, we need to have that in worship. So we need to put it out there on the marquee. Well, this is what a lot of churches are doing as they move away from plain Bible teaching, plain Bible honoring God, to watching movies, to listening to testimonies, to reading poetry. All of those things is what's happening out there. And I've talked to a few people that are in those passionate, spirit-filled worship assemblies. And you know what? The answer is, the reason it's like that is because we want to do exactly like they did in the first century. When they gathered together in the first century, that's what kind of worship services they had, don't you know? Because they were spirit-filled, and we want that kind of worship because we want the kind of worship that they had in Bible times. Now, that's a noble appeal. But here's the rub. That's not the way it was in the first century. That's not the way it was in Bible times. Attention-arresting worship. Now I think about the first century, and you know what? There's no doubt in my mind that there were times when you're that close to the cross and you have the apostles there with you. There's no doubt when you had those things going on in the first century assemblies of Christ that there were things that, I'm telling you what, that had to happen that you looked right at it and you couldn't get your eyes off of it. And all the distractions in the world would not distract you at all. In Acts chapter 20 was such an occasion. Eutychus fell out of a window and he 3 stories high. Now imagine us being in an upper room and somebody falling out the window. Here's an apostle preaching. I tell you what, we'd be fixed on that. And then what's Paul going to do next and all of that? Read verse 9. A young man named Eutychus, sitting at the window, sank into a deep sleep. As Paul talked longer, and being overcome with sleep, he fell down the 3rd story and was taken up dead. Think about Paul's passionate preaching. Sit at the edge preaching that Paul was doing. An apostle of Jesus Christ. Here's an attention-arresting worship service. Well, I'll tell you what, we're so focused on the apostle preaching. Kid falls out the window, dies. Can you imagine that? Now listen, when you go to sleep, don't worry, I'll see you, and I know it don't bother me. It really don't. Don't try to hide it, I know, and it doesn't bother me. And I don't take it personally. And obviously, Paul didn't take it personally. Hey, the guy went to sleep while I'm preaching, forget him, he's dead. He didn't do that. He didn't do that. But can you imagine first century worship? There Paul is an apostle. He's preaching, and it's so attention-grabbing, guy passes out. You know what? How can I hold a light to an apostle? Can't do it. Spiritually spontaneous. They have spiritually spontaneous worship back then, first century. Why, sure they did. While the Holy Spirit was there, guiding them, miraculous things were happening. But you know what? It's just the opposite of that. It's just the opposite. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 40, that spontaneous worship that we're talking about, they were commanded not to do it. He says, but all things should be done decently and in order, he says. Worship assemblies were supposed to be conducted properly, in an orderly way, he says, in an orderly manner. This idea of the Spirit coming in and making people speak in tongues and prophesying and all of that, that was not done. That's wrong. Let's notice that same chapter. Let's see what he says about that. Notice what he says in verse 27. With what's going on at Corinth at this time. Verse 27, he says, if any man speak in a tongue, let there be only two or at the most three, and each, how they're going to do it? In turn. And let someone interpret. Now, if there's no one to interpret, let each of them keep silent in the church and speak to himself, and he says to God. When the Spirit gave someone something to speak in tongues, they were supposed to do what? Wait on an interpreter. They were to keep that to themselves if there was no interpreter. They should not speak. Wait their turn. The Spirit doesn't just come in, even in the first century, and grab someone and they just uncontrollably start speaking in another language in the assembly. It didn't happen then. Paul instructed it not to happen then, and if it didn't happen then, I promise you, it doesn't happen today. Well, notice what else. Look at verse 29. Let two or three prophets speak, and let the others weigh what is said. If a revelation is made to another sitting there, let the first be silent. For you can all prophesy. How are you going to do that? One by one. Doesn't that sound decent and in order? Certainly does. So that all may learn and all may be encouraged, he says. And the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. For God is not the God of confusion. He says God is the God of peace. If God granted revelation to someone at Corinth here, he was allowed to speak, but if the revelation was granted to someone else during that time, what's that? The first one did what? Shut up. He became silent. What was the purpose? God's not the God of confusion. And my worship assemblies are going to be decent. They're going to be done in order. That's the way I want it. That's what God's telling. The Spirit just doesn't grab somebody, whatever gift they have, and make them talk. What's he say? He says that they have the what? The prophets have the power over the Spirit, over the Holy Spirit that gives them the gift. In other words, if that was you, you had the ability to prophesy, you had the ability to speak in tongues or interpret, guess what? You have the control. Not the Spirit. You have the control in the assembly. Therefore, it's you that are responsible to control it. Why? So that the worship assembly will be decent and in order. Well, emotionally electrifying. Did they have an emotionally electrifying worship service in the first century? I think so. Can you imagine being 20 years shy of when the Lord died? There were people there that probably walked and talked with the Lord. There were people in those places that seen the Lord, that remembered the Lord. And all of those things. Being that close, I have no doubt that people's emotions were fired up sometimes, as well as they should be, about the Lord's death. Even now, the Lord's death needs to motivate us, to help us, and to think it's an emotional event. One of the most emotional event of all time. Hearing about false teaching then ought to, just like now, it ought to stir our emotions. We ought not to like it. It ought to evoke feelings. Watching somebody confess the Lord and being immersed in water for the forgiveness of sins. Folks, that ought to stir emotion. That ought to evoke emotions in us. But was worship feelings? Is that what worship was? Was worship feelings? Here's an amazing thing. In various forms of the word feel, and we all have the word search and computers and things, and you know what? Not one single time in the whole Bible, both Old and New, did I find where anyone felt the presence of the Lord. Not once. Nowhere. You can look it up. Nowhere in the Bible did anybody feel the presence of the Lord. Now, did a little dance with that, and I found some things in the New King James, and interesting, just two places that he talks about faith and not about feelings, but he talks about feelings, and there's only two places connected with worship. One of them is in Deuteronomy 4:19. And in that, those that were involved in that, he rebukes those who feel driven. And you have to go to the New King James to even get the word feel. But they feel driven to worship the stars and the moon. So here we got some people that feel driven, they just feel it now, to worship the stars and moon. And then 1 Samuel 13:12, we got our friend Saul, who felt, there's the word, and it's in New King James too, he felt compelled to offer an unlawful sacrifice. So much for feeling-based worship. All right? Well, let's let God explain what this means. Let's turn to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5. They didn't have that kind of worship, but I believe they had this kind of worship. Notice verse 15, Ephesians 5. He says, look carefully now how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. And do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit. There's our word. Addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with all of your heart, giving thanks always and for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting to one another out of reverence, he says, for Christ. Now, I believe that they had a worship service like God wants us to have. And I believe in that there's an obligation to be personally circumspect, he says. Now, that's not what the English Standard Version says. The New American Standard Version says that we must be careful how we walk. The King James Version says to walk circumspectly, all right? During worship, the worship period, really your life. Now, that word circumspect comes from two words, spect, which gets our ideas of spectacles, how we see, and circum is around, all right? Now, what he's saying is, when you're in worship service, you need to not just do this, you need to look around. You need to observe what's going on. You need to walk circumspectly. You need to, really our word would be, you need to pay attention to what's going on. That obligation and that responsibility is on you. Now, is there always going to be some interruption? Is there always going to be distractions in worship service? Sure are. There sure are going to be distractions in worship service. Always. Don't forget it. But our obligation is to see what? To see what's going on. Not observe the distractions. And so he tells the Ephesian brethren that we're passionately worshiping God when we're making ourselves do what? Focus in on Spirit-filled worship. It's our obligation. All these other distractions don't mean anything. Not a thing. And I'll tell you what, maybe it's because of my ADD, but there was I can't count how many times we got in the car after worship service and Jeannie would say, you know what, you didn't see or hear anything about the kids. You did. I don't. Just block it out. Focus it out. How about some help next time? I'll get you next time. And I'm not there. I'm watching what's going on and everything else is zoned out. I'm not saying that you have the ability to do that, but I'm saying that God says you need to have the responsibility to do that. You want Spirit-filled worship? Pay attention to what's going on. Listen to what's going on instead of everything else that shouldn't be going on. And I've said before, go to sleep, have babies crying, get up and down, do what you want. Right now today, I could care less. It doesn't bother me. Maybe because I'm still zoned in. We need to pay attention. Well, in that passage too, notice verse 18. It's the perfect passage, I think, regarding what we're talking about. Don't get drunk with wine. It's a debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. How do we do that? What does that mean? There's our word, to be filled with the Spirit. Now, amazingly, those that have the marquees that say, passionately Spirit-filled worship, those that are saying that, they look at that, and you know what? They've compared being drunk. They've compared being drunk with being filled with the Spirit. And they've come up with this unbiblical term, unscriptural term, because they don't know what they're talking about. And you know what people are out there? When they go to those passionate filled worship services, they're drunk with the Spirit. They're drunk with the Spirit. That's what they are. And Paul was not comparing being drunk with being filled with the Spirit. Actually, in this text, Paul was contrasting the two. To being drunk with the Spirit, It's totally opposite of what it means to be filled with the Spirit. Being filled with the Spirit means that, I'll tell you what, you just absolutely don't know what you're doing. The Spirit has got you, and it's just like you're a drunk man. You're just being led by the Spirit, saying and doing whatever the Spirit wants you to do. No, sir. But that's what they think. That's what they believe this passage says. Wine means that you're drunk. Filled with the Spirit means that there is an element of self-control. That's what that means. The more you drink, the less control you have. The more you're filled with the Spirit, the more control you have in worship service. Drinking alcohol leads to what? Excess, debauchery, lack of self-control. Being filled with the Spirit leads to godly, orderly worship. That's what it does. Not out of control worship, but wise, circumspect, reverent worship. That's what he's talking about. Well, what does being filled with the Spirit mean then? If it doesn't mean I can be drunk with the Spirit, if that's not what he's talking about, how do we get filled with the Spirit? Well, I want you to notice a comparison here. Notice verse 17 with verse 18. Do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Don't be foolish. Here's what you need to do. You need to understand what the will of the Lord is. Verse 18. Don't get drunk with wine, all right, but be filled with the Spirit. Being drunk with wine, Paul says, is foolish, understanding what the Lord's will is. Understanding what the Lord's will is being filled with the Spirit. We need to soak that up. That's what we need to absorb. That's what we need to get in us. Now, parallel passage, and I don't think I have it on your handout. Colossians 3:16. You guys rode me hard last week with all those passages. I dropped a few. Colossians 3:16. Now this is a parallel passage. It fits perfect. Let the word of Christ do what? Richly dwell within you. What does that do? With all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Did you see it there? Ephesians 5, understand what the will of the Lord is. How do you do that? Being filled with the Spirit. Colossians 3, let the word of Christ do what? Dwell in you richly or completely. Now, we don't have Spirit-filled worship by some spontaneous, miraculous worship service. We have it by filling our minds with Christ and paying attention to that, focusing in on that, on the words that are being taught and spoken. Spirit-filled worship is not some kind of series of emotion or outburst, not knowing what you're doing because you just can't help yourselves in the presence of God because the Spirit has you. Not at all. Spirit-filled worship is submitting to God by knowing His Word, obeying His Word, and worshiping based on His Word. That's what he says. Letting God's Word do what? Really actually govern us, lead us. I must do what he says. And you know what? It doesn't matter how I feel. I still must do what he says. And you know what? After I'm done doing what he says, I might not feel like it, but you know what you've done? You worship God. You've worshiped God. That's what Paul wants to say. Therefore, he closes, verse 17, whatever you do in word or deed, certainly is in his word. We're certainly doing something, this deed of worship. It needs to be what? All in the name or by the authority of Jesus Christ. Passionate, Spirit-filled worship is word governed. I promise you that's the truth. Something else. I think that kind of worship service is God-focused. Spirit and in truth. You know, modern expectations are, I'm going to say they're amazingly me-focused. We come here, I'll tell you what, who's it about? Same person it's about out there. We live in a me society. Everything's about me. The world revolves around me. What's it done for me? What's it going to be for me? What can you offer me? I don't go there anymore because they don't offer me anything. Everything's me focused out there and here a lot of times. Now, that's not what Spirit-filled worship is about. Spirit-filled worship is about God. It's about God. and revering God. It's not for you. Believe it or not, you're not here this morning for you. You're here for God and God Almighty. In that same text, in 19 and 21, we're to sing, make melody in our hearts. Who to? You? Me? No, sir. To the Lord, he says. I think verse 20, he says, giving thanks to, everything to who? God the Father. Spirit-filled worship is not about getting anything from God. He's already gave us everything. He's gave us His Son, His life. Spirit-filled worship is about us giving Him. It's not about us coming here and God pouring something down on us. It's about us coming here and pouring ourselves out to God. I tell you what, we don't deserve entertainment. We don't deserve all this stuff that me thinks we got to have. We deserve hell. That's what we deserve. It's almost like we come here and think that God still owes us. God does not owe us anything. Nothing. We don't go away from this place. Oh, I know I've been to worship service. Oh, I can feel it. I know I've been there. No, sir. You go away from this place saying, I know that I've been to worship service because of all the things that I gave to God. Not what I got. How I honored God and worshiped God. That's when you know you've been to a passionate, spirit-filled worship service. One more thing. Not only God-focused is the first century worship service, but it's others-oriented. And that sort of goes along with the me thing again. Once again, we find ourselves self-centered in modern worship, in our modern way of thinking and how things ought to be, you know. They sing the songs for me. I hope they pick the ones out for me. And you know what? I don't know. You know what? That guy's not talked to me for a year. And you know what? I just didn't like the way the guy shook my hand. And look how his hair's combed. And look how he's dressed. This place isn't for you. It's not for you to size up everybody that way. It's not about pleasing you. What's this place about? It's about edifying, what's this text say? One another. Each other. This place, this assembly is about worshiping God and you and your responsibility for each other. You're out of the picture. You're out of the picture. We gather here to do for them. It's not about whether you please me. That's not what it's about. That's not what it's about at all. This is about us giving us our all so that we can edify others. Be a strength as a shield for others. No doubt. When we worship properly, you're going to feel edified. You're going to feel built up. But as a worship service, helping others and submitting others to Christ is what it's all about. I want passionate, spirit-filled worship just as much as the next guy wants it. God said worship Him in spirit and in truth. We need to have the right attitude and we need to have the right information in order that we worship God in spirit and in truth. Passionate, spirit-filled worship, the things that we previously talked about, all of that, everything that's going on out there is vain worship. It's not what they did in the first century at all. But I'll tell you what, I'm not willing to sell out for the glamour, for the glitz, for the entertainment, for the vain worship, for people that are struggling and their misguided attempts for worship. And that's all it is. That is all it is. God has told us what He wants. He does not want emotional outbursts. He does not want spontaneous feelings, uncontrollable actions. Doesn't want it. He wants decent. He wants order. He wants circumspect worship. He wants you, while you're here, to pay attention to what you're doing because you've been instructed to do what He said to do. You need to do it to the best of your ability. Worship God in spirit and in truth. Forget the crap that's out there. It's out there bad. Pouring ourselves out to Him, not because He overwhelms us, but because you want to honor Him and you want to worship Him. Submit to one another. Submit to one another. This isn't about you. This is passionate, spirit-filled worship. And I can tell you, no matter what it feels like, it still is. And you know what? There's I guess a paradox in that. When you do this, most of the time, the paradox is when you do it like we're supposed to do it, you know what you're going to do? You're going to feel like you worship according to God, according to Spirit and truth. How you been worshiping this morning? Same old boring place? Same old junk? Did you go to sleep? Did you clip your fingernails? Got something burning in the oven? How is it out there for you today? You know what? There's going to be people that are members of the Church of Christ lost to eternal hell because they did not worship God in spirit and truth. And they have the misconception about what this place is about and who it's about and how they conduct themselves here. Lord, didn't we go to services 3 times a week? Depart from me, I never knew you. That's not just for our denominational friends to hear. There's going to be lots of folks in churches of Christ that go, I thought I did it all right. How you been worshiping God? Compassionate, spirit-filled worship that he requires from us. Jesus said, he that believes and is baptized shall be saved. Please come as together we sing.